If you found yourself here tonight, welcome. Maybe you've just finished a long day, one that felt a little too full, or maybe not full enough. Or perhaps it's your evening off, and you're simply looking for a quiet moment, just for you. Maybe you stir a student, your mind still tangled in thoughts. Or maybe you're lying in bed, hoping that rest will come a little easier this time. Whatever brought you here, I'm truly glad you've joined me. There sits nothing you need to do now. No responsibilities, no decisions. Just breathe in slowly, and out. Let your shoulders relax. Let your breath deepen, and allow the noise of the day to gently fade. You stir safe here. You stir not alone. And my only role tonight is to keep you company, to speak softly, and guide your mind somewhere far from now, into the quiet shadows of the past. Tonight, we drift back to the spring of 1618, to the ancient heart of Prague, where towering walls of stone hold centuries of secrets. Picture yourself inside the cool halls of Prague Castle. The scent of parchment and polished timber in the air, the muffled stir of a city alive, with tension, just beyond its gates. And now, imagine a window, and 3 men, being thrown through it. Yes, tonight we explore the defenestration of Prague, a moment so strange, so abrupt, so theatrical, that it almost feels like fiction. But it wasn't set. It was a spark, tossed from a high window, that landed on centuries of dry kindling, and set all of Europe ablaze. Those men survived the fall, but the peace of Europe did not. This single act would ignite the 30 Years' Sept War, a conflict of faith and power, kingdoms and pride, that would reshape the continent forever. But don't worry, I'll tell you everything slowly, gently. You don't need to follow every detail. Just listen and drift. Let your imagination carry you through palaces and battlefields, through treaties and betrayals, through whispers that became war cries. And if this quiet journey brings you even a little peace, if you find comfort in these softly told stories from the corners of time, feel free to leave a like or subscribe. That way, I can be here again tomorrow night, to guide you into another forgotten moment, and maybe help you sleep just a little more soundly. Sleep well. Chapter 1. Religious tensions boil over. Imagine yourself as a citizen of Prague in the early 1600s, waking each morning to the sound of church bells that ring not just to mark the hours, but to remind you of the invisible battle being fought for your very soul. The city around you is a tapestry of architectural styles and religious traditions, where Gothic cathedrals stand alongside newer Baroque churches, each representing not merely different aesthetic choices, but fundamentally different visions of Christian faith. The streets you walk are narrow and winding, paved with uneven stones that have witnessed centuries of processions, both Catholic and Protestant. The air carries the mingled scents of brewing beer, wood smoke from countless hearths, and the faint trace of incense drifting from various churches. But beneath these familiar aromas lies something else, the almost metallic taste of tension, the way the atmosphere feels heavy before a thunderstorm. You live in a kingdom where religious identity has become political identity, where the faith you practice determines not only your relationship with God, but your relationship with earthly power. The Habsburg emperors, ruling from distant Vienna, have made it increasingly clear that Catholic unity is essential to imperial unity. To them, religious diversity represents political fragmentation, a crack in the foundation of their authority that threatens to split their realm apart. The roots of this tension stretch back nearly a century, to when Martin Luther's revolutionary ideas first took hold in German-speaking lands. Bohemia, with its traditions of religious independence, dating back to the martyred reformer Jan Hus, proved particularly receptive to Protestant teachings. By the late 1500s, perhaps 2/3 of Bohemian nobles had embraced some form of Protestantism, whether Lutheran, Calvinist, or belonging to the indigenous Bohemian Brethren. For a time, an uneasy peace prevailed. In 1609, Emperor Rudolf II, perhaps recognizing the futility of forcing religious uniformity upon his diverse subjects, granted the Letter of Majesty to Bohemian estates. This remarkable document guaranteed religious freedom to Bohemian nobles and towns, allowing them to build churches, choose their own pastors, and practice their faith without interference. It seemed for a moment that the age-old dream of religious tolerance might actually take root in the fertile soil of Central Europe. But peace built on paper often proves as fragile as the parchment on which it's written. When Rudolf died in 1612, he was succeeded by his brother Matthias, a man whose commitment to Catholic orthodoxy burned with a harder flame. Though Matthias initially promised to honor the letter of majesty, his actions spoke louder than his words. Catholic advisors surrounded him like moths drawn to flame, whispering that religious unity was the only path to political stability. The change in atmosphere was subtle at first, like the way shadows gradually lengthen as afternoon turns to evening. Protestant churches found their construction permits mysteriously delayed. Catholic monasteries, long dormant, suddenly received generous imperial endowments. Protestant nobles noticed that royal favor seemed to flow more readily toward their Catholic neighbors. The letter of majesty remained officially in force, but its spirit began to wither like a plant denied sunlight. By 1617, when Matthias was aging and the question of succession loomed large, the stakes had grown dramatically higher. The man chosen to inherit the Bohemian crown was Archduke Ferdinand of Styria, a prince whose devotion to the Catholic cause was as uncompromising as winter frost. Ferdinand had already demonstrated his approach to religious diversity in his own lands, where he had systematically expelled Protestant pastors and required all subjects to convert to Catholicism or face exile. The prospect of Ferdinand's rule sent waves of anxiety through Protestant Bohemia, like ripples spreading across a disturbed pond. Noble families who had built their lives around their faith faced the possibility of choosing between their beliefs and their homeland. Pastors who had devoted their lives to serving their congregations contemplated the likelihood of forced departure, or worse. Ordinary citizens watched nervously as the delicate balance that had preserved their religious freedom began to totter. The crisis came to a head in late 1617 and early 1618, when two incidents shattered the fragile pretense of religious tolerance. In the town of Klostergrad, local Catholic authorities ordered the demolition of a Protestant church, claiming it had been built illegally on church lands. The building was torn down stone by stone, its congregations scattered like leaves before an autumn wind. Soon after, in the town of Brno, another Protestant church met the same fate, its wooden beams and carefully crafted altar reduced to a pile of splinters and ashes. These were not mere local disputes over property rights, but deliberate provocations that struck at the heart of Protestant fears. The churches had been built with the explicit permission granted by the Letter of Majesty, their destruction a clear signal that imperial promises meant nothing when they conflicted with Catholic determination. The message was unmistakable. Ferdinand's approaching reign would bring not accommodation but conquest. Throughout the winter of 1617 and into the spring of 1618, Protestant nobles held increasingly urgent meetings in Prague's elegant palaces and ancient halls. They gathered around polished wooden tables illuminated by flickering candlelight, their voices low but their words charged with desperation. Some counseled patience, hoping that diplomatic pressure might yet preserve their rights. Others spoke of resistance, though none yet dared voice the word that hung unspoken in the air: rebellion. The Habsburg response to these stirrings of discontent was swift and uncompromising. In May 1618, Ferdinand appointed a council of regents to govern Bohemia in his name, men whose Catholic credentials were beyond question and whose loyalty to imperial authority was absolute. Chief among them were Vilém Slavata and Jaroslav Borzita, both zealous Catholics who viewed Protestant resistance not as legitimate political opposition, but as heretical defiance of divinely ordained authority. The regents established their headquarters in Prague Castle, that ancient fortress that had served as the seat of Bohemian power for over 1,000 years. Its massive walls of grey stone seemed to embody the weight of tradition and the permanence of royal authority. From their chambers high above the city, the regents could look down upon the red-tiled roofs and church spires of Prague spread below them like a vast map of the territory they intended to reclaim for Catholic unity. But those same walls that symbolized unshakable power would soon witness an act of defiance so dramatic, so unprecedented, that it would echo through the corridors of history for centuries to come. The Protestant nobles, driven beyond the boundaries of patience by the destruction of their churches and the appointment of hostile regents, were preparing to take a step from which there could be no retreat. The stage was set for confrontation. Religious conviction had hardened into political determination. Imperial authority had calcified into inflexible demand for submission. The Letter of Majesty, once a bridge between competing faiths, had become merely another piece of parchment to be ignored or torn asunder. In the narrow streets below Prague Castle, Protestant nobles sharpened their swords and steeled their resolve. In the castle chambers above, Catholic regents drafted proclamations and counted on imperial power to crush any resistance. Neither side yet realized that they stood on the precipice of a war that would devastate Europe for a generation, turning fertile fields into graveyards and prosperous cities into ruins. The morning of May 23, 1618, dawned clear and bright over Prague, the spring air carrying the fresh scent of new leaves and blooming flowers. It seemed on the surface like any other day in the ancient city, but beneath the calm exterior, tensions that had been building for months were about to explode with the force of a powder keg, hurling 3 men from a castle window and plunging a continent into 3 decades of war. Chapter 2. Thrown from the castle. The morning of May 23, 1618, arrived with deceptive tranquility. Picture yourself standing in the courtyard of Prague Castle, as the first rays of sunlight pierce the morning mist, casting long shadows across the ancient cobblestones. The air is crisp with spring freshness, carrying the distant sounds of the city awakening below, the creak of wooden cartwheels, the calls of merchants preparing their stalls, the gentle lowing of cattle being driven to market. Nothing in this peaceful scene suggests that within hours, this very courtyard will witness an act so extraordinary that it will be remembered for centuries. In the narrow streets and elegant palaces of Prague's lesser town, Protestant nobles have been gathering since before dawn. They move through the shadowed alleyways with purposeful steps, their faces set with the grim determination of men who have reached the end of their patience. These are not wild-eyed revolutionaries, but established members of Bohemian society, wealthy landowners, learned lawyers, military officers who have served the crown with distinction. Yet today, they carry themselves like soldiers preparing for battle, their hands resting unconsciously on sword hilts, their eyes scanning the approaches to the castle with tactical awareness. The leader of this unlikely band of rebels is Count Heinrich Matthias von Thurn, a man whose very presence seems to command respect. Imagine him as he strides through the morning streets, tall and dignified, his beard carefully trimmed, his clothing elegant but practical. Von Thurn has served the Habsburg emperors faithfully for decades, leading their armies and managing their territories with skill and loyalty. But the destruction of the Protestant churches has transformed this pillar of the establishment into something far more dangerous, a man with nothing left to lose. Beside him walks Vaclav Budovec of Budova, a scholar and diplomat whose gentle demeanor masks a core of steel. Budovec has spent years trying to resolve the religious crisis through negotiation and compromise, crafting careful letters and attending endless meetings in the hope that reason might prevail over prejudice. Today, his scholarly robes are replaced by practical clothing suitable for more direct action, though his eyes still carry the sadness of a man who has watched his life's work crumble into dust. The Protestant nobles number about 100 as they approach the castle gates, their footsteps echoing off the stone walls like a drumbeat of destiny. They are not an angry mob, but a disciplined assembly of men who have made a calculated decision to risk everything for their faith and their rights. Some carry formal documents, petitions and legal briefs that outline their grievances in careful legal language. Others bear weapons, though these remain sheathed, symbols of determination rather than instruments of immediate violence. The castle guards at the gates eye this approaching procession with growing unease. These are men accustomed to the rhythms of court life, where conflicts are fought with whispered words and subtle snubs rather than direct confrontation. The sight of so many Protestant nobles moving with such unified purpose sends ripples of anxiety through their ranks. Yet the nobles are not violating any laws by requesting an audience with the regents. Technically, this appears to be nothing more than a large delegation seeking to present their grievances through proper channels. As the Protestant nobles pass through the castle gates and into the great courtyard, the weight of history seems to press down upon them. These stones have witnessed the coronations of kings, the signing of treaties, the rise and fall of dynasties. The very air seems thick with the accumulated power of centuries, as if the ghosts of ancient rulers watch from the shadows of doorways and window alcoves. Yet today, this ancient seat of authority is about to become the stage for an act of defiance that will shake the foundations of the old order. The regents, Vilém Slavata, Jaroslav Borzita, and their secretary Philip Fabricius, are conducting their morning business in the council chamber on the castle's second floor. Picture this room as it was that morning: elegant tapestries hanging from stone walls, polished wooden furniture gleaming in the filtered sunlight that streams through tall windows, the air carrying the faint scent of beeswax candles and old parchment. The three men sit around a heavy oak table covered with official documents, their faces bearing the satisfied expressions of administrators confident in their authority. Slavata, the most senior of the regents, is a man whose devotion to Catholic orthodoxy burns with unwavering intensity. Imagine him bent over a stack of papers, his quill scratching as he drafts yet another decree designed to curtail Protestant rights. His face, marked by years of bureaucratic service, shows no trace of doubt about the righteousness of his cause. To him, the Protestant complaints are not legitimate grievances, but the whimperings of heretics who refuse to accept divine truth. Borzita shares his colleagues' religious fervor, but brings to it a sharper edge of political calculation. As he reviews reports from across Bohemia, his eyes narrow with satisfaction at news of Protestant pastors departing their parishes and Catholic priests taking their places. He sees himself as an instrument of imperial will, reshaping Bohemian society to match the emperor's vision of religious unity. The comfort of the council chamber, with its thick walls and commanding view of the city below, reinforces his sense of unassailable authority. Fabricius, their secretary, busies himself with the endless paperwork that lubricates the machinery of government. His desk is covered with correspondence, legal documents, and administrative orders, each piece of paper another thread in the web of control that the regents are weaving across Bohemia. Though not noble-born like his superiors, Fabricius has aligned himself completely with their cause, understanding that his own advancement depends upon their success. The sound of approaching footsteps echoes through the castle corridors, like distant thunder. At first, the regents pay little attention. The castle is always full of courtiers, servants, and petitioners going about their business. But as the footsteps grow louder and more numerous, as voices begin to carry through the stone walls, an uneasy awareness begins to penetrate their comfortable bubble of authority. A servant rushes into the chamber, his face pale with anxiety. "Your Excellencies," he stammers. "There is a large delegation of Protestant nobles requesting an immediate audience. They say they have urgent business that cannot wait." The regents exchange glances, annoyed at this interruption to their morning routine. They are accustomed to controlling the timing and circumstances of such meetings, to receiving advance notice and prepared statements. This unscheduled intrusion strikes them as impertinent, though not yet threatening. "Very well," Slavata says, with the weary air of a man performing an unwelcome duty. "Show them in. Let us hear what complaints they bring today." The regents remain seated around their table, maintaining the formal hierarchy that places royal authority above noble privilege. They expect the usual ritual: bowed heads, respectful addresses, carefully worded petitions that acknowledge imperial supremacy, even as they seek minor adjustments to policy. Instead, the Protestant nobles enter like a tide of righteous anger contained within the bounds of aristocratic dignity. Count von Thurn leads the procession, his bearing erect, and his eyes blazing with controlled fury. Behind him come the others, landowners whose properties have been threatened, military officers whose service has been questioned, scholars whose libraries have been searched for heretical books. They fill the chamber with their presence, transforming what should have been a routine audience into something that feels more like a confrontation between armies. The air in the room grows thick with tension, as the two sides face each other across an unbridgeable divide. The regents, still seated at their table, represent the old order of unquestioned authority and religious conformity. The Protestant nobles, standing in disciplined ranks, embody the spirit of resistance that has been building for months like pressure in a sealed vessel. Between them hangs the unspoken question of whether this confrontation can be resolved through words, or whether it must escalate to something far more dramatic. Von Thurn steps forward, his voice steady but carrying an edge that makes everyone in the room pay attention. "Gentlemen," he begins, "we come before you not as supplicants seeking favors, but as legitimate subjects of this kingdom demanding justice. The destruction of our churches at Klostergrab and Braunau was not merely an attack on buildings of stone and wood, but an assault upon the fundamental rights guaranteed to us by His Majesty's own Letter of Majesty." The Regent Slavata rises from his chair, his face flushing with indignation. "You forget yourself, Count," he responds sharply. "Those buildings were erected in violation of church law, on lands that properly belong to Catholic institutions. We acted within our authority to correct long-standing abuses. His voice carries the confidence of a man who has never doubted his own righteousness, but there is something in the Protestant noble's demeanor that makes him shift uncomfortably. Church law, Budovec interjects, his scholar's training evident in the precise way he marshals his arguments. The Letter of Majesty explicitly grants us the right to build churches on our own lands and in towns where we hold jurisdiction. These rights were not granted by your grace, but by imperial decree. Do you now claim authority to override the emperor's own promises? The argument escalates with each exchange, voices rising as carefully maintained diplomatic courtesy begins to crack under the pressure of fundamental disagreement. The regents invoke imperial authority and Catholic doctrine, while the Protestant nobles cite legal precedent and contractual obligation. But beneath the formal language of political discourse runs a deeper current of existential fear. The Catholics' terror of religious fragmentation, the Protestants' horror of spiritual enslavement. The moment of crisis arrives almost without warning, like the instant when a dam finally gives way under pressure that has been building for years. One of the younger Protestant nobles, pushed beyond endurance by Slavata's dismissive responses, shouts out words that transform the entire character of the confrontation. These men are traitors to Bohemia and enemies of our faith. They have violated their oaths and betrayed the trust placed in them by our rightful king. The accusation of treason hangs in the air like the smell of gunpowder after a musket shot. In the hierarchical world of early 17th century Europe, such words cannot be unsaid or forgiven. They represent a direct challenge to the entire system of royal authority upon which the regents base their power. The careful pretense of civilized negotiation suddenly strips away, revealing the raw conflict between irreconcilable worldviews that has been building for months. What happens next unfolds with the inevitability of an avalanche, each action triggering consequences that cannot be controlled or reversed. The Protestant nobles surge forward, no longer petitioners seeking audience but accusers demanding justice. The regents back away from their table, suddenly aware that the familiar trappings of authority, the elegant chamber, the official documents, the weight of imperial appointment, offer no protection against the focused anger of desperate men. The three regents find themselves surrounded, pressed back against the tall windows that offer such a commanding view of Prague below. Slavata attempts to maintain his dignity, drawing himself up to his full height and invoking the authority of the emperor. "You dare not lay hands upon appointed representatives of his imperial majesty," he declares, though his voice wavers with uncertainty. Such action would be tantamount to treason against the crown itself. But the Protestant nobles have moved beyond such considerations. Months of frustration, years of mounting pressure, generations of religious conflict have compressed into this single moment of decision. Strong hands seize the three regents, lifting them despite their struggles and protests. The careful protocols that govern aristocratic behavior dissolve in the face of revolutionary determination. The tall windows of the council chamber swing open, revealing the 70-foot drop to the castle courtyard below. The morning air rushes in, carrying with it the sounds of the city going about its peaceful business, unaware that history is being made in the room above. For a moment that seems to stretch into eternity, the three regents hang suspended between the world of established authority they have known and the unknown consequences of this unprecedented act of defiance. Then, with a collective heave that represents the explosion of months of contained fury, the Protestant nobles thrust Slavata, Borzita, and Fabricius through the open windows and into the void beyond. The three men plummet through the morning air, their official robes billowing around them like the wings of ungainly birds, their voices raised in cries of shock and terror that echo off the castle walls. The courtyard below erupts in confusion as servants and guards witness the impossible sight of three royal officials falling from the sky. Time seems suspended as the bodies tumble through space, spinning slowly in the bright morning sunlight before disappearing from view behind the castle's outer walls. The Protestant nobles crowd at the windows, watching the trajectory of their victims with expressions that mingle satisfaction, horror, and disbelief at their own audacity. In that moment of falling, as the three regents plummet toward an uncertain fate, the old order of Habsburg authority begins its own descent into the chaos of religious war. The careful balance of power that has held Central Europe together for decades shatters like glass striking stone. The age of compromise and accommodation dies in the span of a heartbeat, replaced by an era of conflict that will consume a generation and reshape the map of Europe. The sound that reaches the Protestant nobles at the windows is not the dull impact they expect, but something far more surprising. The voices of the three regents, raised not in final agony, but in what sounds remarkably like ordinary complaint. Against all expectation, against all probability, the 70-foot fall has not proven fatal. Slavata, Borzita, and Fabricius are alive, though whether by miracle, luck, or the intervention of divine providence, will become a matter of fierce debate in the hours and years to come. The defenestration of Prague is complete, but its consequences are only beginning to unfold. In the space of a few dramatic minutes, a religious dispute has become a political revolution, and a political revolution is about to become a continental war. Chapter 3: Miraculous Landing. Picture yourself standing in the castle courtyard, in the immediate aftermath of that extraordinary moment, watching as three figures tumble through the morning air with an almost dreamlike quality. The scene unfolds with a strange mixture of violence and absurdity that will echo through the corridors of European memory for centuries to come. In those suspended seconds, as Slavata, Borzita, and Fabricius plummet toward the earth, the very fabric of political reality seems to tear apart and remake itself. The fall itself takes perhaps 4 seconds, long enough for a man to contemplate his mortality, short enough that shock prevents any coherent final thoughts. Imagine the sensation experienced by the three regents as they tumble through space. The sudden weightlessness, the rushing wind, the spinning view of castle walls and distant city rooftops. Their elegant court dress, so carefully chosen to project authority and dignity, now streams around them like ceremonial banners marking their passage from power to vulnerability. Below, in the narrow space between the castle walls and the moat that once protected this ancient fortress, the ground rises to meet them with inexorable certainty. But this ground is not the hard-packed earth or stone paving that might be expected in such a place. Instead, centuries of accumulated refuse from the castle above, kitchen scraps, stable cleanings, the countless small disposals of daily life, have created a landscape that will prove unexpectedly merciful to the falling regents. The first to strike the earth is Vilene Slavata, his body hitting with a sound like a heavy sack of grain dropped from a wagon. He lands not on stone or packed soil, but in a depression filled with the soft detritus of castle life. The impact drives the breath from his lungs and sends shock waves through his aging frame, but the yielding surface absorbs much of the force that would otherwise have shattered bones and ended lives. He lies motionless for a moment, his mind struggling to process the transition from falling through air to lying upon solid ground. Jaroslav Borzita follows a heartbeat later, his trajectory carrying him to a spot perhaps 10 feet away, where accumulated organic matter has created another cushioning mound. His landing is similarly dramatic, a tremendous thud that seems to shake the very foundations of the castle, but like his colleague, he finds himself bruised and stunned, rather than broken and dying. The carefully maintained beard that had been his pride that morning is now caked with mud, and worse, but the face beneath it still draws breath. Philip Fabricius, the secretary whose only crime was loyalty to his superiors, completes the trio of miraculous survivors. His lighter frame carries him slightly further from the castle wall, where he impacts in what appears to be a pile of garden waste mixed with the less pleasant but equally soft contents of the castle's waste disposal. The landing knocks him unconscious for several minutes, but when awareness returns, he discovers that his limbs remain intact and his injuries, while painful, are far from fatal. The immediate aftermath of their landing is marked by a profound silence that seems to envelop the castle grounds like a blanket. The sounds of the city below, the calls of merchants, the rumble of cartwheels, the distant lowing of cattle continue as if nothing extraordinary has happened. But within the castle walls, time seems suspended as everyone struggles to comprehend what they have just witnessed. From the windows 70 feet above, the Protestant nobles peer down at the courtyard with expressions that mix triumph, disbelief, and growing unease. They had expected their dramatic gesture to produce clear consequences, either the satisfying finality of justice executed, or the terrible weight of blood on their hands. Instead, they find themselves confronting something far more ambiguous. 3 men who should be dead but are manifestly alive, whose survival will inevitably be interpreted as carrying meaning far beyond mere chance. Count von Thurn, still standing at the window through which he helped hurl the regents, watches the scene below with the calculating mind of a military commander. He understands immediately that the survival of Slavata, Borzita, and Fabricius transforms the entire character of what has just occurred. What might have been remembered as a moment of revolutionary justice will now become something far more complex, an event that both sides will claim as evidence of divine favor for their cause. The first to reach the fallen regents are castle servants who had been going about their morning duties when three human forms suddenly plummeted from the sky. These men and women, accustomed to the predictable rhythms of court life, find themselves thrust into a situation that defies all normal experience. They approach the fallen figures with the hesitant steps of people unsure whether they are witnessing miracle or catastrophe. Slavata is the first to speak, his voice hoarse but unmistakably alive. Help me to my feet." The words carry across the courtyard with shocking normalcy, as if men fell from castle windows every day and required nothing more than assistance in regaining their dignity. The servants who hear him cross themselves reflexively, uncertain whether they are witnessing divine intervention or some form of supernatural occurrence. As the three regents are helped to their feet and assisted toward the castle's medical quarters, the competing interpretations of their survival begin to crystallize with remarkable speed. The castle's Catholic residents, already predisposed to see divine providence in earthly events, immediately recognize the hand of God in this miraculous preservation. To them, the fact that three faithful servants of the Church have survived a fall that should have killed them represents unmistakable evidence that heaven itself endorses their cause. Father Johannes, the castle chaplain, arrives on the scene while the regents are still being dusted off and examined for injuries. His trained theological mind immediately grasps the propaganda value of what has occurred. "Behold," he proclaims to the gathering crowd of servants and guards, "how the Blessed Virgin protects those who serve her faithfully. No mortal power could have preserved these faithful souls from certain death. This is a sign, as clear as any miracle recorded in sacred scripture." The chaplain's interpretation spreads through the castle's Catholic community, with the speed of flame through dry tinder. Within hours, the story being told in Prague's Catholic churches describes how the Virgin Mary herself caught the falling regents in her protective embrace, lowering them gently to earth, as a mother might place sleeping children in their beds. Some versions of the tale speak of angels visibly supporting the falling men, their wings creating currents of air that slowed their descent and guided them to the softest possible landing. Slavata himself, once he has recovered sufficiently to speak coherently, embraces this interpretation with the fervor of a man who has experienced what he believes to be direct divine intervention. "I felt myself supported by invisible hands," he tells anyone who will listen. "The Virgin Mother of our Lord reached down from heaven itself to preserve her faithful servants. Let no one doubt that God himself stands with the Catholic cause in these troubled times." But the Protestant interpretation of events proves equally swift and equally confident, though it points in a dramatically different direction. From their perspective, the survival of the three regents represents not divine miracle but earthly good fortune, or perhaps even divine justice tempered with mercy. The fact that three enemies of their faith have lived to face the consequences of their actions strikes them as evidence that God prefers justice to martyrdom. The Protestant version of events, which begins circulating through Prague's reformed communities, before the regents have even reached the castle's medical quarters, focuses not on heavenly intervention, but on the embarrassing realities of their landing site. According to this account, Slavata, Borzita, and Fabricius owe their lives not to angelic support, but to the accumulated refuse of castle life, including, most prominently, the contents of the castle's latrines and stables. "They fell into a dung heap," becomes the succinct Protestant summary of the morning's events, delivered with the sort of satisfied smirk that suggests divine providence has a sense of humor. This interpretation sees the survival of the regents as God's way of ensuring that they live to face earthly consequences for their betrayal of Protestant rights, while simultaneously providing an object lesson in humility for men who had grown too proud in their exercise of power. Some Protestant commentators go further, suggesting that the soft landing represents divine mercy extended even to enemies, a demonstration that Reformed theology's emphasis on grace applies even to those who oppose it. "God preserved their lives," explains one Protestant pastor, "not because they deserved salvation, but because his mercy extends even to those who know not what they do. Perhaps this experience will open their hearts to the truth they have so long resisted." The physical evidence at the landing site does little to resolve the competing interpretations. The depression where the regents landed does indeed contain organic matter that would have cushioned their fall: kitchen scraps, stable cleanings, garden waste, and yes, human waste from the castle's primitive sanitation system. But whether this accumulation represents fortunate coincidence, divine preparation, or something else entirely depends entirely on the theological and political predispositions of the observer. Dr. Polixenes Leoninus, the castle physician who examines the regents in the hours following their fall, provides a medical assessment that manages to satisfy neither side completely. All three men, he reports, have suffered significant bruising and various minor injuries, cuts, scrapes, and what would later be called mild concussions. Slavata has injured his back and will walk with difficulty for several weeks. Borzita has damaged his shoulder and will carry his arm in a sling. Fabricius has the least serious injuries, but complains of persistent headaches. By all medical knowledge, Dr. Leoninus confides to his personal journal that evening, these men should have died from such a fall. The human body is not constructed to survive impact after a descent of 70 feet onto hard ground. That they live at all defies natural explanation. Whether one attributes their survival to divine intervention, extraordinary fortune, or the cushioning effect of accumulated organic matter depends, I suppose, on one's philosophical disposition. The regents themselves, once recovered enough to participate in the theological debate surrounding their survival, prove unanimous in their interpretation of events. All three men describe sensations during their fall that they can only interpret as supernatural intervention. Slavata speaks of feeling supported by invisible hands. Borzita describes a sense of weightlessness that seemed to extend his time in the air beyond what physics would suggest. Fabricius, despite his secular background, insists that he felt a presence during his descent that he can only describe as divine. I am not by nature given to mystical experiences. Fabricius writes in a letter to his brother several days after the defenestration, my education was practical, my temperament rational. But what occurred during those moments of falling cannot be explained by reason alone. Something beyond mortal understanding intervened to preserve our lives. Whether one calls it the Virgin Mary, angelic protection, or divine providence matters less than the undeniable fact that we three should be dead, yet live. The survival of the three regents transforms what might have been a clear-cut act of revolutionary violence into something far more ambiguous and ultimately more dangerous. Had they died, the Protestant nobles could have claimed to have executed justice upon traitors to Bohemian liberty. Their deaths would have provided a clean ending to the confrontation, however tragic. Instead, the miraculous survival creates a situation where both sides can claim divine endorsement for their cause. Catholic preachers throughout Prague and beyond seize upon the survival story as proof that heaven itself supports the Habsburg cause and condemns Protestant rebellion. The regents, they proclaim from pulpits across the Holy Roman Empire, were preserved by God to continue their righteous work of restoring religious unity to Bohemia. The miracle of their survival represents divine judgment upon those who would oppose the true faith. Protestant ministers respond with equal vigor, arguing that the survival of the regents represents not divine protection but divine mercy, God's refusal to allow the Protestant cause to be stained with unnecessary blood. The embarrassing circumstances of their landing, they suggest, represent divine humor directed at men who had grown too proud in their authority. Their survival ensures that they will live to face the earthly consequences of their betrayal of Protestant rights. The competing miraculous narratives that emerge from the defenestration prove to have consequences far beyond Prague's city limits. Across Europe, Catholics and Protestants seize upon the story as confirmation of their existing beliefs about divine providence and earthly authority. What began as a local political crisis in Bohemia rapidly transforms into a theological controversy with continental implications. In Munich, the Catholic League interprets the survival of the regents as a sign that God supports their efforts to restore religious unity to the German territories. In Vienna, Emperor Ferdinand, still Archduke at the time of the defenestration, but soon to inherit the crown, sees in the miracle confirmation that heaven endorses his plans for the forcible conversion of his Protestant subjects. In Rome, Pope Paul V orders special prayers of thanksgiving for the preservation of these faithful servants of the Church. Meanwhile, in the Protestant courts of northern Germany and Scandinavia, the story of the defenestration takes on equally significant but opposite meaning. The survival of the regents, they argue, demonstrates that God refuses to allow Protestant hands to be stained with unnecessary blood, even when dealing with enemies of religious freedom. The humiliating circumstances of their survival prove that divine justice operates through earthly means rather than heavenly violence. As spring turns to summer in 1618, the story of the three men who fell from Prague Castle windows begins to take on a life of its own, growing and evolving with each retelling. Catholic versions emphasize angelic intervention and miraculous preservation. Protestant accounts focus on dung heaps and divine humor. Neutral observers, few though they are in this polarized age, note simply that three men fell 70 feet and lived, leaving the interpretation of that remarkable fact to others. But whatever interpretation one places upon the survival of Slavata, Borzita, and Fabricius, one fact remains indisputable: their miraculous preservation ensures that the Prague Defenestration will be remembered not as a successful execution, but as a failed assassination attempt. This failure will have consequences that reverberate far beyond Bohemia, providing both Catholic and Protestant Europe with competing miracle stories that seem to justify whatever actions their respective sides choose to take in the rapidly approaching war. The three regents, battered but alive, retreat to their chambers to recover from their injuries and plan their response to the Protestant rebellion. The Protestant nobles, their dramatic gesture transformed by circumstance into something more ambiguous than they intended, begin to contemplate the broader implications of their actions, and across Europe, armies begin to march toward Bohemia, drawn by the competing certainties that have emerged from a single moment of miraculous survival. Chapter 4. The War Erupts. In the days following the Defenestration, Prague transformed from a city of simmering tensions into the epicenter of a revolutionary storm that would soon engulf all of Europe. Picture yourself walking through the ancient streets in late May 1618, observing how quickly the rhythm of daily life yields to the urgent preparations of approaching conflict. The morning markets that once echoed with the cheerful haggling of merchants and customers now buzz with whispered conversations about armies and alliances. The peaceful chiming of church bells has acquired an ominous undertone, as if each bronze voice calls not to prayer but to war. The immediate aftermath of the window throwing spreads through the city, like ripples expanding across a disturbed pond. News travels with remarkable speed through Prague's network of servants, merchants, and craftsmen, each retelling adding new details and interpretations to the basic facts. By evening of May 23rd, there is hardly a soul in the city who has not heard some version of the morning's extraordinary events, though the versions differ dramatically depending on the religious sympathies of the teller. In the Protestant quarters of the city, the Defenestration is celebrated as a long overdue act of justice against imperial tyranny. Tavern keepers find their establishments filled with animated discussions, as reformed citizens debate the broader implications of Count von Thurn's bold action. The mood is one of nervous exhilaration, the feeling that comes when a community finally acts upon grievances that have festered for too long. There is satisfaction in the knowledge that Protestant nobles have finally stood up to Catholic oppression, mixed with anxiety about what consequences might follow. The Catholic neighborhoods, by contrast, react with horror and indignation at what they perceive as an unprecedented attack upon legitimate authority. In the elegant palaces where noble Catholic families maintain their Prague residences, the evening's conversations center on outrage at Protestant audacity and gratitude for the miraculous preservation of the three regents. These communities see the Defenestration not as justified resistance but as criminal rebellion that threatens the very foundations of civilized society. The three surviving regents, still nursing their injuries but very much alive, waste no time in crafting their response to the Protestant challenge. From their chambers in Prague Castle, they dispatch urgent letters to Vienna, informing Emperor Matthias and Archduke Ferdinand of the unprecedented assault upon royal authority in Bohemia. Their accounts, naturally enough, emphasize the criminal nature of the Protestant action while downplaying any mention of the policy decisions that provoked it. Most Sacred Majesty, writes Slavata in his official report, we have been subjected to violence unprecedented in the history of this realm. Protestant rebels, abandoning all pretense of loyalty to your crown, seized our persons and attempted to murder us by casting us from the windows of your own castle. Only by divine intervention were our lives preserved to continue serving your imperial cause. We humbly request immediate military assistance to restore order to this rebellious province. The letter, carried by swift riders along the roads that connect Prague to the imperial capital, reaches Vienna within days. The imperial court's reaction is everything the regents could have hoped for: shocked outrage at Protestant audacity combined with firm resolve to restore Habsburg authority through whatever means necessary. Emperor Matthias, already in declining health, but still capable of imperial fury, immediately begins mobilizing the resources needed to crush Bohemian resistance. Archduke Ferdinand, who will soon inherit not only the imperial crown, but also the crisis in Bohemia, responds with characteristic determination to destroy all opposition to Catholic orthodoxy. The Defenestration, he declares to his advisors, represents not merely political rebellion, but religious heresy that threatens the spiritual welfare of his future subjects. His response must be swift, decisive, and sufficiently overwhelming to discourage similar resistance in other corners of his vast domains. But the Protestant nobles, having crossed the Rubicon of open rebellion, prove equally quick to seek allies and justify their actions. Count von Thurn, understanding that Bohemia cannot stand alone against Habsburg power, immediately begins crafting appeals to Protestant rulers throughout Germany and beyond. His letters paint the Defenestration not as unprovoked violence, but as necessary resistance to Catholic tyranny that threatens all of Protestant Europe. Your Highness will understand, von Thurn writes to the Elector Palatine Frederick V, that our action was forced upon us by the unconscionable violations of our ancient rights, the destruction of our churches, the appointment of hostile regents, the systematic persecution of our faith. These crimes against both divine and human law left us no choice but to defend ourselves through dramatic action. We humbly request your support in resisting the Catholic assault upon Protestant liberty. Similar letters flow from Prague to Dresden, Berlin, Stockholm, and The Hague, each carefully crafted to appeal to the specific interests and fears of its recipient. The Protestant nobles understand instinctively that their survival depends upon transforming a local Bohemian crisis into a broader European struggle between competing religious and political systems. They must convince their co-religionists that what happens in Prague will determine the fate of Protestantism everywhere. The responses to these appeals reveal the complex web of alliances and enmities that crisscross early 17th century Europe. Some Protestant rulers, like the Elector of Saxony, express sympathy for Bohemian grievances, while carefully avoiding any commitment to military support. Others, particularly the Dutch Republic and various German Protestant princes, begin quietly preparing for the possibility of armed intervention on behalf of their Bohemian brethren. The most significant response comes from Frederick V, the young Elector Palatine, whose territories along the Rhine make him a natural leader of German Protestant resistance to Habsburg power. Frederick's court in Heidelberg has long served as an unofficial centre of Protestant political coordination, and his marriage to Elizabeth Stuart, daughter of the English King James I, provides potentially valuable connections to broader European networks of opposition to Catholic dominance. Frederick's initial response to von Thurn's appeal is cautious but encouraging. While stopping short of immediate military commitment, he expresses strong sympathy for Bohemian Protestant concerns and begins consulting with his advisors about the possibility of more substantial support. His caution reflects not indifference to the Protestant cause, but recognition that any intervention in Bohemia will likely trigger a broader European war with consequences impossible to predict or control. As summer progresses, the crisis in Bohemia escalates with frightening speed. The Protestant nobles, having seized effective control of Prague and much of the surrounding territory, begin establishing the infrastructure of an independent government. They create new administrative systems, appoint Protestant officials to replace dismissed Catholics, and most significantly, begin raising an army to defend their rebellion against the inevitable Habsburg counterattack. The military preparations reveal both the strengths and weaknesses of the Protestant position. On the positive side, many Bohemian nobles possess extensive military experience from campaigns against the Ottoman Empire and various German conflicts. Count von Thurn himself is a seasoned commander who understands both strategy and logistics. The Protestant cause also benefits from widespread popular support in much of Bohemia, where anti-Catholic sentiment runs deep and memories of Jan Hus remain vivid. But the weaknesses are equally apparent to anyone who examines the situation objectively. Bohemia, despite its wealth and strategic location, is ultimately a single kingdom surrounded by Habsburg territories. The Protestant army, while enthusiastic, lacks the professional training and equipment of imperial forces. Most critically, the rebels cannot be certain of receiving the foreign support they desperately need to survive against the full might of the Habsburg military machine. The international dimension of the crisis becomes increasingly apparent as autumn approaches. What began as a local religious dispute in Bohemia has begun to activate the fault lines that divide all of Europe along confessional boundaries. Catholic powers, the Habsburg domains, the Papal States, the Spanish Empire, the Catholic League in Germany, begin coordinating their response to what they perceive as a fundamental challenge to both religious orthodoxy and political stability. The Protestant powers face a more complex decision. Many sympathize with Bohemian grievances and fear that Habsburg victory will embolden Catholic authorities throughout Europe to intensify persecution of reformed communities. But direct intervention in Bohemia means war with the most powerful dynasty in Europe, a conflict that could easily spiral beyond anyone's control and devastate the territories of those who participate. King James VII of England exemplifies the dilemma facing Protestant rulers. As a committed Protestant, he sympathizes with Bohemian resistance to Catholic oppression. As the father-in-law of Frederick V, he has family connections to those most likely to support the Bohemian cause. But as the ruler of a kingdom still recovering from decades of conflict with Catholic Spain, he hesitates to provoke another costly war that might bankrupt his treasury and endanger his subjects. The French position proves equally complex but for different reasons. King Louis XIII and his chief minister Cardinal Richelieu are devout Catholics who might be expected to support Habsburg efforts to restore religious unity, but they are also French patriots who view Habsburg power as the primary threat to French security and independence. The prospect of a war that weakens Habsburg's strength while avoiding direct French involvement proves surprisingly attractive to Parisian policymakers. As 1618 draws to a close, the positions of the major European powers crystallize into the pattern that will define the coming conflict. The Habsburg domains, supported by the Catholic League and Spanish resources, prepare to crush Bohemian resistance with overwhelming force. The Protestant powers, led reluctantly by Frederick V and supported by Dutch money and Swedish military expertise, begin assembling the coalition needed to defend Reformed Christianity against Catholic reconquest. The trigger for open warfare comes in the spring of 1619, when the Bohemian estates take the final step that transforms religious rebellion into political revolution. Meeting in formal assembly, they declare Ferdinand deposed as King of Bohemia and offer the crown to Frederick V, the Protestant Elector Palatine. This action moves beyond resistance to specific policies toward outright rejection of Habsburg rule, creating a constitutional crisis that cannot be resolved through negotiation or compromise. Frederick's acceptance of the Bohemian crown, after months of agonized deliberation, represents the point of no return for both sides. He becomes the Winter King, a title that will prove prophetic when his reign ends in defeat and exile after barely a year. But his coronation in Prague also transforms the Bohemian crisis into a European war, as Catholic and Protestant powers abandon their cautious preparations and commit fully to the destruction of their religious enemies. The military campaigns that follow demonstrate both the scope of the conflict and the limitations of early 17th century warfare. Armies march and countermarch across the German territories, their movements constrained by primitive logistics and the need to live off the lands through which they pass. Battles, when they occur, are often inconclusive affairs that settle little beyond the immediate fate of the soldiers involved. The decisive engagement comes at the Battle of White Mountain in November 1620, where imperial forces under the command of Johann Seclès, Count of Tilly, crush the Protestant army defending Prague. The battle itself lasts only a few hours, but its consequences reverberate for decades. Frederick V flees into exile, Bohemian Protestant resistance collapses, and Habsburg authority is restored with a vengeance that will reshape Central European society for generations. The aftermath of White Mountain reveals the true cost of the conflict that began with 3 men falling from a castle window. The victorious Catholic forces, encouraged by Jesuit advisors and imperial policy, undertake a systematic campaign to eliminate Protestantism from Bohemia entirely. Protestant nobles face execution, exile, or conversion. Protestant pastors are expelled or imprisoned. Protestant churches are demolished or forcibly converted to Catholic use. But the victory at White Mountain does not end the 30 Years' War. It merely concludes its first phase. The broader European conflict, triggered by the Prague Defenestration, but now sustained by its own momentum, continues to spread across the continent like wildfire consuming dry timber. Denmark enters the war to defend Protestant interests. Sweden follows with armies that will march as far south as Bavaria. France eventually joins to limit Habsburg power. Spain commits resources to support its Austrian cousins. The human cost of this expanding conflict defies easy comprehension. Armies of unprecedented size march back and forth across Germany, consuming crops, burning towns, and reducing once prosperous regions to wasteland. Disease follows in the wake of military campaigns, spreading plague and typhus through populations already weakened by hunger and displacement. Some estimates suggest that the German territories lose 1/3 of their population during the 30 years of warfare that began with the Prague Defenestration. The religious character of the conflict gradually gives way to more traditional concerns about power, territory, and dynastic advantage. Catholic France allies with Protestant Sweden against Catholic Austria. Protestant Saxony supports Catholic emperors against Protestant rivals. The clear theological divisions that seemed so important in 1618 blur into the grey complexities of international politics and military necessity. Peace, when it finally comes with the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, establishes principles that will govern European international relations for centuries. The concept of state sovereignty, the balance of power between competing nations, the principle that rulers may determine the religion of their territories. All these ideas emerge from the ashes of the conflict that began when 3 men were thrown from Prague Castle windows. The word defenestration itself becomes permanently embedded in the vocabulary of political violence, a term that captures not just the specific act of throwing someone from a window, but the broader human tendency to resolve complex disputes through dramatic gestures that often produce consequences far beyond their perpetrator's intentions. The Prague Defenestration of 1618 joins its 1419 predecessor in the lexicon of historical moments when symbolic actions trigger events that reshape the world. Looking back across the centuries, the remarkable thing about the Prague Defenestration is not that it happened. Early modern Europe was full of religious tensions that might have exploded into war under different circumstances, but that such a seemingly absurd incident could have such profound consequences. 3 men thrown from a window, 3 men who survived against all probability, and 30 years of war that devastated a continent and killed millions. The survival of Slavata, Borzita, and Fabricius, which seemed at the time like a miracle that vindicated one side or the other, ultimately proved irrelevant to the broader forces their defenestration unleashed. Whether they lived or died, whether angels or dung heaps deserved credit for their preservation, the religious and political tensions that drove Protestant nobles to violence were too deep and widespread to be resolved by any single incident, however dramatic. The true legacy of the Prague Defenestration lies not in the competing miracle stories it generated, or the immediate political crisis it precipitated, but in the way it demonstrates how individual acts of violence can tap into vast reservoirs of social tension and religious hatred that transform local conflicts into continental catastrophes. In that sense, the 3 men who fell from Prague Castle windows became not just survivors of an assassination attempt, but unwitting catalysts for one of the most destructive wars in European history. As our journey through this remarkable chapter of history draws to a close, let us return once more to that castle window high above Prague, where on a bright spring morning in 1618, 3 men tumbled into space and changed the course of European civilization. The story we have followed together, from the religious tensions that divided Bohemia to the continental war that consumed a generation, reminds us how the grand sweep of history often turns on moments that seem almost absurdly small in comparison to their consequences. Picture yourself now, standing in the courtyard of Prague Castle on a peaceful evening in our modern age. The ancient stones beneath your feet have witnessed 8 centuries of human drama, but the violence and suffering we have explored tonight have long since given way to the quiet rhythms of tourism and contemplation. Where Slavata, Borzita, and Fabricius once landed in their miraculous heap of refuse, manicured gardens now bloom with seasonal flowers. The windows from which they fell have been restored and reglazed countless times, each pane of glass a transparent barrier between our comfortable present and that turbulent past. The physical scars of that morning's violence have healed so completely that a casual visitor might never suspect that this tranquil spot once served as the stage for an act of defenestration that would echo through the corridors of European memory for centuries. Yet in the silence of evening, when the tourist crowds have departed and the castle settles into its nocturnal stillness, it seems possible to hear whispers of that long-ago confrontation carried on the night wind. The 3 men whose survival seemed so miraculous to their contemporaries lived on for many years after their dramatic fall, though their later lives proved far less eventful than that extraordinary morning. Wilhelm Slavata continued to serve Habsburg interests until his death in 1652, his back forever bearing the subtle reminder of his encounter with Protestant fury. He never wavered in his conviction that the Virgin Mary had personally intervened to preserve his life, and he commissioned countless masses of thanksgiving for what he considered his miraculous deliverance. Jaroslav Borzita similarly lived to see the end of the 30 Years' War, dying peacefully in 1638, after a career spent implementing the Catholic reconquest of Bohemia with methodical thoroughness. His injured shoulder healed well enough to allow him to continue his administrative duties, though he was said to favor that arm during changes in weather for the rest of his life. Like his colleague Slavata, he never questioned the divine origin of his survival. Philip Fabricius, the secretary whose only crime was loyalty to his superiors, perhaps suffered the most lasting consequences from his fall. His head injuries, though not immediately life-threatening, left him with persistent headaches and occasional difficulties with memory that plagued him until his death in 1641. Yet he too lived long enough to witness the transformation of Bohemia into a thoroughly Catholic kingdom, his survival contributing to the very outcome that his Protestant defenestrators had sought to prevent. The irony of their survival extends far beyond the personal fates of these three individuals. The miracle that both sides claimed as vindication of their cause ultimately served to prolong rather than resolve the religious conflict that had generated such passion. Had they died, their martyrdom might have satisfied Protestant anger and provided a clear ending to the confrontation. Instead, their preservation ensured that both Catholics and Protestants could claim divine endorsement for whatever actions they chose to take in the escalating conflict. Count Heinrich Matthias von Thurn, the Protestant noble who led the defenestration, lived to see his cause triumph briefly and then collapse catastrophically. After Frederick Vie's defeat at White Mountain, von Thurn fled into exile, spending his remaining years as a wandering soldier in the service of various Protestant powers. He died in Sweden in 1640, far from the Bohemian lands where he had once wielded such influence, his dramatic gesture having ultimately achieved the opposite of what he intended. The broader lessons of the Prague defenestration extend far beyond the specific circumstances of early 17th century religious conflict. The story illustrates how individual acts of violence, however justified they may seem to their perpetrators, can unleash forces that quickly escape human control or prediction. The Protestant nobles who threw 3 men from a castle window intended to strike a blow for religious freedom. Instead, they triggered a war that devastated the very communities they sought to protect. This pattern, the way symbolic gestures can tap into vast reservoirs of social tension and transform local conflicts into continental catastrophes, has repeated itself throughout human history. The assassination of an Austrian archduke in Sarajevo in 1914 triggered the First World War through a similar mechanism of escalating alliances and competing nationalisms. The burning of draft cards in the 1960s helped catalyze a generational conflict over American involvement in Vietnam. The defenestration of Prague belongs to this category of historical moments when individual actions acquire significance far beyond their original intent. Yet there is something uniquely absurd about the specific mechanism of defenestration that sets it apart from other forms of political violence. The act of throwing someone from a window carries an almost childlike quality of impulse and immediate gratification that contrasts sharply with the sophisticated theological and political arguments that supposedly justified it. The image of 3 dignified officials tumbling through space with their robes billowing around them contains an element of dark comedy that persists even across 4 centuries of historical analysis. Perhaps this absurdist quality helps explain why the Prague defenestration has retained such a firm grip on historical memory. More significant battles were fought during the 30 Years' War, more important treaties were signed, more influential leaders rose and fell. But the sheer dramatic audacity of resolving a complex political crisis by throwing people out of windows continues to capture imaginations in a way that more conventional forms of political action cannot match. The word defenestration itself has become a permanent part of our political vocabulary, extending far beyond its literal meaning to encompass any sudden or dramatic removal from power. Modern politicians speak of being defenestrated by their parties when they are suddenly dismissed from leadership positions. Corporate executives worry about defenestration by hostile boards of directors. The term has evolved from describing a specific act of violence to representing the broader human experience of sudden, unexpected falls from positions of authority and influence. This linguistic legacy may be the most enduring consequence of that morning's events in Prague Castle. Long after the religious passions that motivated the original defenestration have cooled into historical curiosity, long after the political systems that generated such conflicts have been replaced by more tolerant arrangements, the word itself persists as a reminder of how quickly human situations can change and how dramatically individual actions can reshape collective destinies. As you settle into the comfort of your present moment, surrounded by the securities and freedoms that previous generations could never have imagined, it is worth reflecting on the distance we have traveled from that world where religious differences could trigger continental wars and political disagreements could be resolved by throwing opponents from windows. The Prague of 1618 was a city where a person's faith determined not only their relationship with eternity, but their safety in the here and now, where theological disputes could become matters of life and death with frightening speed. Our modern world, for all its complexities and challenges, has largely moved beyond the assumption that religious uniformity is essential to political stability, the idea that governments should enforce particular forms of Christian belief upon their subjects, the assumption that drove both Catholic regents and Protestant nobles to such desperate measures has given way to broader concepts of religious tolerance and individual conscience that would have seemed impossibly utopian to the participants in our story. This evolution represents one of humanity's great achievements, though it came at a cost measured in centuries of warfare and millions of lives. The 30 Years' War that began with the Prague Defenestration was only one chapter in Europe's long struggle to learn that people of different faiths could coexist within the same political systems without necessarily destroying each other. That lesson, purchased with such enormous suffering, remains one of our most precious inheritances from those difficult centuries. Yet, as we drift towards sleep in our comfortable present, it is worth remembering that the passions that drove men to throw their opponents from windows have not disappeared from human nature. They have simply found different outlets and different justifications. The same impulses that led to religious warfare in the 17th century can manifest as ideological conflict in the 21st. The same certainties that justified defenestration can motivate other forms of political violence in our own time. The story of the Prague Defenestration thus serves not only as a fascinating glimpse into a distant past, but as a gentle warning about the perennial human tendency to resolve complex problems through dramatic gestures that often create more difficulties than they solve. The three men who survived their fall from Prague Castle windows lived to see their world consumed by the very war their defenestration helped to trigger, a reminder that even the most righteous anger can produce consequences that extend far beyond anyone's ability to predict or control. As the ancient city of Prague settles into another peaceful night, its cobblestone streets now illuminated by electric lights rather than flickering torches, its churches serving communities that worship freely rather than under compulsion, the echoes of that long-ago morning seem to carry a message of both warning and hope. The warning reminds us how quickly civilization can unravel when people become convinced that their opponents are not merely wrong but evil. The hope lies in the knowledge that humanity has proven capable of learning from such experiences, of building systems that channel conflict into less destructive forms than defenestration and war. Let the story of three men who fell from a window and lived, and of the war that followed their miraculous survival, accompany you gently into sleep, with the reminder that our present peace, however imperfect, represents the hard-won wisdom of countless generations who learned, often through bitter experience, that tolerance and compromise serve humanity better than righteous fury and dramatic gestures. In that spirit of gratitude for lessons learned and progress achieved, may you rest peacefully in the knowledge that the age of defenestration has passed into history, leaving us free to dream of better ways to resolve our differences than throwing each other from windows. Sleep well, gentle listeners, and may your dreams be filled not with the echoes of ancient conflicts, but with visions of the more peaceful world that their resolution has made possible.